Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Peter Doris. I'm the environmental specialist for OMAFRA for East Central Ontario, and that means that I essentially deal with manure. So if we go to the next slide here, and you click one more. So I would like to point out at the start that handling and maximize manure is the title of the talk, but we're not trying to maximize the amount of volume. Like, we're not encouraging you to add water or more trips to the field, so you might want to carry on. I think what we're focused on here is about the value of manure and maximizing the value of the manure. And I'm kind of the, I'll use a baseball analogy here, I'm the setup guy for your speakers here today. So they're gonna impart to you some practical wisdom here, and hopefully I can set them up for that. Next slide, please. So I guess a couple of quick things here. I'm going to just do a quick comparison about beef versus dairy manure, just as an example, just to show you that there is some differences in nutrient value. I'm going to tie it into the soil test, and that's one of the key things that I want to encourage you to keep in mind with this presentation, is about the value of the soil test. And then finally, we're going to look at crop rotation, managing manure, and the 4 R's plus 1. Next slide. So on the slide there, you see there is beef manure versus dairy manure. Both are dry. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that if we think particularly beef cows versus dairy cows, typically the beef cow is not fed as high in energy and higher protein as the dairy cow. And so we would think that the manure is higher nutrient value coming out the back end. And generally speaking, I would agree with you, except for the fact that the dairy manure is wetter. And so that dry matter content that you see on the screen there, the beef is coming in around 32%, the dairy cow is coming in about 25%. It does have an impact on usable nutrients there. So if you look at a 10-ton per acre application for each of them, you can see there you're getting to that 40-50 pounds of nitrogen, 37 to 61 pounds of P2O5, and 130 or 140 pounds of K2O. And so I guess what I would say with a little bit of caution, if we go to the next slide, is, and most of you probably know this, is that manure all available in the year of application? And we do know that a fair bit of it is tied up in the organic portion, and it's a bit like the old Canada savings bonds that we used to have, that used to have the coupon that you would clip each year. So that solid manure will pay dividends, you know, beyond the year of application, but it will pay 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And the same thing works with the nutrient applications as well. Do you have a nutrient analysis for that manure? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a diehard advocate for saying that you have a manure analysis, and I'll explain later on. But the soil test, I would say, becomes probably even more important in that. And there is data bank values for manure, as the slide indicates. For your nitrogen portion, that's probably the biggest variable there. Different manures will have different availability of nitrogen. So if you have a solid manure, a lot of that N is going to be tied up. It's really good stuff over a number of years, but it's not going to be all there in the year of application. And then, of course, with ammonia, with the more liquid manure and poultry manure, a higher portion is going to be ammonia, and if you apply when it's warm and dry, and if you don't get it incorporated, you're going to lose a portion of that. So that's some of the things there. And then, of course, there's the issue of timing, and I'm going to talk about that a fair bit as well. So in a perfect world, yes, we'd like to apply manure and get it onto the fields in time for the crop to use it, but we know that we have busy springs anyways, and then when you compound them with wet springs on top of that, it makes that job even more of a challenge. And the whole comment, it didn't come up today, but at a couple of the meetings I've come out, people have made the comment that somebody said if it's too wet to do field work, it's also too wet to spread manure. So you shouldn't be taking the manure spreader out for compaction reasons if it's too wet for you to be doing field work as well. Next slide. So soil test becomes important. And so if you account for a portion of your nutrients from the manure there, say half, your soil test becomes important. And basically it's going to answer the question, are you mining the soil? Is your soil test dropping? Are you adding to the bank account? Is it going up? Or are you holding your own? Next slide. And so with this, I would say with the soil test is that there is no such thing as a bad number. So for those of you with low soil test, and those of you who have grid samples, those could very well be your high test or your high yielding areas from the field. So those areas that you're getting the 250 bushel corn, those could be the areas that you have single digit phosphorus levels in your field. because you're pulling that much off your farm. Similarly, the high testing areas, it's working now, wonderful, thank you. The high testing areas, you may not need much in the way of nutrient applications, and in some cases those are places like the knolls where we've lost a bit of the organic matter and things like that. So your soil test can kind of give you some indication, and particularly if we look at zones and things like that within our fields. So I'm going to give you a couple of rules of thumb here. Single digit phosphorus, those are the fields that are great for manure application. Those are the fields that we really want to build up, and those are the ones that are really good to look at. If we're in the teens to the mid-20s, that's where we talk about a modest amount of phosphorus. And by modest amount, that's basically what a starter fertilizer, planted just to help get that seedling out of the ground. And then if you've got a soil test above 25, that's where you're basically, if you have other fields that you can spread manure on, that's where it's a good spot to spread. Because we know from most of our tables that pretty much once you get above 25 or 30, you're not going to see an impact on the crop. You're not going to see additional yield because your soil test is already at that higher rate. And for potassium, some similar rules of thumb, but your scale changes. So we see in long-term hay fields, grass hay fields, particularly on rented farms, the organic matter might be pretty good, might have some pretty good soil biology, but the potassium levels are low. In some cases down 40, 50, things like that. And so if you look at the potassium tables, those fields are really where you need to be focusing on in terms of getting your potassium levels back up. So anywhere below 70, 80, you likely will see a response to additional potassium there. In that area of 80 to 100, it's a relatively modest amount of potassium for most crops. The exception there is when you get above 100, you typically don't need it. The exception is hay. And the reason hay, with respect to potassium, a 3-cut alfalfa crop will pull off roughly about 300 pounds to the acre of potassium. So that's what your crop removal is. So every year, per acre, you're pulling off about 300 pounds per acre of potassium per year. So that hay is taking a lot of potassium with it when it goes off the field. So a couple of things here why that becomes important in the soil test is that for the P2O5, here's the magic number is 35. So if your crop removal, if you're removing 100 pounds off with your harvested crop, for every 35 pounds over or below that number, you're going to move your soil test about 1 part per million. That's the rule of thumb. And so that's where we use the crop removal balance there to kind of track how we're doing in terms of soil test. And for potassium, that number is 20. So every 20 pounds, so remember I say that if you're taking off 300 pounds of potassium with 3 cuts of hay, for rough math, so that alone could move your soil test potassium by about 15. And so when people talk about, wow, the soil test for potassium really dropped after a few years of hay, that's why. And so that is the reason it becomes important. And where it fits in with manure is I would encourage you, if you are using manure, the manure becomes a very good check to basically see if your values are plus or minus, so if your soil test is going up or down, and then you can adjust your fertilizer accordingly to kind of balance out with what the manure you have. So a couple more slides on timing here. So I guess the one thing is we've had 2 very wet falls in 2018 and 2019, and so farms that are relying on corn stover to get their manure out, it's tough. I had a number of calls in December, people saying my storage is full, what do I do? And my general comment is that if you're going to have to apply manure at some time in that winter or that restricted period, usually December is a better time than February or March. So in other words, just don't look at the next 2 weeks or a month, look at the entire winter period, and I would say if you have a good window in December, go for it. If you can, work it in whether it's injection, disking, incorporation of some kind. The minimum storage requirement for nutrient management is 240 days. A couple of things, though, that are important to note. One is we rarely empty a tank all the way out. So that tank will have 240 days of capacity kind of the day it's built. But typically every year when it gets emptied out, it's probably down to about a foot or 2 left in the bottom with the pumps that we have. And so in reality, you probably won't have 240 days if you're leaving a foot to 2 feet in the bottom every time. The other thing is, for those of you in the dairy business and who have had nutrient management strategies, our numbers used to be really short on terms of what we were predicting for dairy manure and wash water values. We've gotten a little bit better, but I still think there's a ways to go there as well. And then the final thing is your crop rotation. So this is where hay, wheat, and soys can really come in corn silage. So that will allow you hopefully to get that manure out when the crop conditions are a little bit better. Final slide. So you're familiar with the 4 R's here on the screen. Here, I'm going to add one more, and that's the right neighbor. So if you have manure, and if your manure storage is full and you've got a cash cropper next door, I would encourage you to work with that cash cropper. And basically, you as the livestock producer have the manure, but you need to get some capacity freed up in your storage here fairly shortly. The cash cropper, and when Jake did the presentation about kind of the sufficiency method versus the build and maintain, I can tell you that virtually anybody who is trying to do the build and maintain is not doing it all with commercial fertilizer. That in other words, to get those soil test values up, they're adding some form of organic amendment, and more often than not, it's manure. So it could be a chance for you, as say a dairy farmer or a beef farmer or a chicken farmer, your soil test may be in a pretty good state already, but you need to get some capacity in your storage there available to you. The neighbor across the road who's got the corn, soybeans, wheat, that wheat ground, that soybean ground, that may be a good spot for manure. Whoops, sorry. For the cash cropper, I would say, yes, that manure has value, but the value doesn't necessarily have to be in dollars transferred. It could be things like straw. So in terms of things that you can do in terms of trading manure for straw, those are some things you might want to look at. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Wilfred now, and I'll run the slides for you, Wilfred. Or actually, I won't need to, I've got the clicker.
So good afternoon, I'm Wilfred Raats. Come from Metcalfe, just south of the city of Ottawa. We're an equipment contracting business. We service mostly south and east of Ottawa with we have several things going on, but today we're talking about manure, so we're mostly in a 60 to 80 kilometer radius of where we are located. We started in 2002. It was actually the start of the system, or start of our company was with manure. We started with a dragline system. We're going to talk a little bit about the nutrients and stuff today, and some of the technologies that we bring to the customers as custom operators. At the time, the Nutrient Management Act was being written, and there was lots of talk about injection becoming mandatory and remote controls for the direct flow systems and so on and so thing. So we decided to get ahead of the curve a little bit, and we invested in injection equipment. We tried to make that work for a couple of years. We tried 2 or 3 different machines. Very limited success, mostly because we were still very heavily bedded in a lot of tie stalls with liquid pits, so we had trouble with the equipment. We had much more variable soils, different cropping practices, so some places we worked the ground too much, some not enough. And then cost was a big issue for most customers because my competitors didn't charge extra to spread the manure. So we abandoned that after a couple of years of trying to make that work. The benefits that everybody touts were evident. There was reduced runoff, there was reduced odors, there's those kinds of things were there, but they weren't valued at the time by the customers. Once we were in the drag line, we had to go into tanks for the further fields. Went to the largest unit on the market at the time, 9500 quad. We weren't very happy with the tire options available. That those tires that were under the machine are actually already overloaded. So this leads to the prior talk with compaction. So when we ordered the second tank, we worked with the manufacturer. We actually had them put on larger tires, which became a standard offering from Wool. 2004, because we handled the liquids, now we ended up having to handle the solids, especially with the sand barns. Got into handling manure with these spreaders. Compaction's an issue. Mostly vertical beaters. We did have a side discharge for some of the slurry stuff. 2011, we upgraded the fleet of equipment, and although they're pretty like that, the technology in the tanks at the time hadn't really changed a whole lot. So we ended up with the same units, all with the bigger tires, but they're basically built the same as 1992 yet. So we worked with that for the next few years. Prior to 2014, part of our biggest issue was the sand slurry in dairy barns. We have quite a few customers with sand bedding. So this is a typical setup: 3 pits, 3 pumps in a pit, mixing like crazy, burning lots of fuel, and then scooping out the leftovers, which is generally most of it. This was very poor as far as nutrient handling goes, because all the water went to the further fields. The solids bound up with the manure bound up in the sand all went to the closest fields because it was messy and expensive and created lots of compaction. So after 10 years of doing this, the soil tests really started to show on some of the farms that the fields behind the barns were getting very overloaded. So we were looking for a different option. None, the local manufacturer, had these things on the drawing board, a crawler boat basically for mixing. We ordered one before they went into production. We had been watching the different options out there. On the left is a competitor brand boat, and obviously it didn't do a good job agitating sand. That's the pit in 2013 that boat is sitting in on the left, and on the right is the same pit in 2014 after we emptied it 2 sessions with the crawler. This has been a godsend as far as getting the nutrients more evenly spread over the whole farm. So that's been made a huge improvement. We actually stepped out of the drag line in 2016. One of my foremen actually stepped up and bought the systems. We were up to 3 systems by that point, so we had our hands full. 2019, we were up to 4 manure tankers in 2018, and of course they were wore out again. So with labor being an issue, we decided to downsize, sort of. We went to 2 17,000-gallon tanks. They're basically, again, ordered ahead of the time. There's now 7 of them now. We just delivered the 7th of these units in the world. So with having only 2 units, we were able to put some different technology on that we otherwise would have a hard time affording. One of the things being the air inflation system, the tire central inflation system. This shows the control here, and of note there we have 4 channels on our system. That the front axle, rear axle, the front tank and the rear tank are all set at their own pressures according to what the axle loads are. So we can optimize the tires. We actually have 480 gallons of air storage underneath the tankers. So when we leave the field, we can flip the switch and we'll get up to almost 20 pounds in the tires and 16 in the tractor to get on the road safely. And by the time we're reloaded, the system theoretically is supposed to be full. We do some quicker turnarounds, which makes it a little bit more difficult. The deflation rate on this particular system is an advantage because it actually lets loose at every tire. So although it sounds pretty bad whenever you let the air go, it all goes out in about 40 seconds. So so the time it takes to travel to headland, by the time we turn onto a spread path, it's they're deflated. Because the sheer volume of tires, it's the biggest system he's ever made. We have some limitations with the compressors, so we're working on some improvements. We started with the standard compressor. It wasn't adequate, so when the second tank came, we put a screw compressor on the other one, and then we added a second compressor to the first tank, but still a work in progress just to get that sheer volume of air that we need 3 times an hour. I'll just play that. Oop, where'd it go?
Want me to do it?
Yeah, can you hit it there? And if you can just note, the only reason I play that is just so you can note the squat in the tires, how much those tires are actually put down while we're in the field. And the advantage we have then with the inflation system, pumping it back up to 40, 45 pounds, we're a lot safer on the road, and we Empty, we do drive 50 kilometers an hour. From the soil compaction day that we had in Dundas last summer, proof in the pudding for the air system, that's fully inflated with the full load, deflated with the load going over the sensors. So the other thing we added onto the tanks mid-season last fall, which is fairly new to North America, this sensors that were available in Europe already since 2015. In Holland in particular, it's mandatory that they sample every load of manure. So this technology has been developed to actually give on-the-fly analysis of NP and K and ammonium nitrate and dry matter. This system was released last summer in North America, and we have our units set up with them. So there are some of the components then. It works together with a flow meter to get the volume, and the NIR lab is actually under the yellow box there. It's basically it's almost the same unit as they use for the forage harvesting stuff. So the monitor's there, and there's some interesting things on this particular picture. That's upper left, it shows you the screen that the operator sees. The light blue is one tanker, and the dark blue is the other one. So as they're working, they see what the other guy is doing, which works really nice in the dark or in the snowstorm. The bottom right there is the arrow. So we don't have a gate valve on our tanker. We charge by the gallon, so we're not going to slow the flow down. So as the whatever specs the farmer's looking for, we enter in a computer and it'll tell us to drive faster or slower according to what's coming out of the pipe. This particular job, if you notice the constituents on the bottom or on the left there, this was a new customer, sand manure, that he normally spreads 10,000 gallons an acre and didn't really agitate it properly. So when we were agitating now, we ended up with 300 pounds of N per acre, which we suggested might not be the best use of his manure, but that's not, he wanted 10,000 gallons an acre. So being able to measure this will certainly give the customers a little bit better or more options to utilize their manure better. So the data, of course, it's a work in progress for us to learn how to deal with this, what the practical implications are going to be. A couple of things that have come to light already. If we have the maps from the farmers already downloaded with the sensitive features in them, we no longer have to chase down the farmer and get him in a pickup and show us the fields, and so our operators save some time during the day. From the agronomist standpoint, when they're doing a fertilizer program, they will know where we skip the setbacks and where they have to balance the nutrients on a commercial application. And anyway, it makes for pretty maps. One of the bigger advantages, which I neglected to mention yesterday, and which alludes to Peter's talk here, some our customers have limited land base and they've been overloading their fields, and the neighbors have been shy to take manure because they don't know what it's worth. They don't know what's in it. So now we are able to at least give them the values. They can determine what dollars change hands, but at least as a cash cropper, they can see the value of what's being added to their fields. So for the future, we order these tanks equipped, ready to go for incorporating toolbars again. Talked to my key clientele. Out of 6 of them, 1 of them said, "I'd like to try that." The other 5 said, "You're going to take them off at my place because I don't want that weight across my field." So we're still not ready for incorporation toolbars in Ontario, as far as I can tell. So our options are going to have to be cover crops and applying manure at different times of the year, perhaps side dressing unit, some way to avoid the picture on the right. There's no value in doing that. It's a great risk for us to be out on the ice, and last fall we spent 5 weeks out on the ice with these rigs, and you know, a lot of nutrient value not being fully taken advantage of. So I think that's about all I got.
So I farm in Blackstock. We are just on the edge of what's called the Oak Ridge Moraine, and we farm part of the Oak Ridge Moraine and just work north and east of it. So the Oak Ridge Moraine is a major natural water filtration system for basically the GTA in Lake Ontario. So Swain beef, right now we grow mostly crops, or all crops, grain corn, silage corn, soybeans, fall wheat, azukis, and oats. Crops is 50% of our business, and livestock's the other 50%. We background and finish around 400 feedlot cattle annually, and we're producing about 800 metric ton of packed manure annually. I farm right now with my father. He turned 75 this month, and my wife, Nicole. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from University of Guelph, and I graduated with a diploma in ag business. And we've had our first full-time employee for 3 years now that's worked with us. So we've been no-tilling pretty well 100% for a little over 10 years now. The only reason we wouldn't no-till any of our crops is because either we're doing field maintenance or some tiling or just really some correction of ruts or marks we made in fields, or last spring where it was Scott's patience got short and we just couldn't wait for the soil to get dry enough to put our crops in. Our home farm now is about 220 acres. When I started farming with my dad in the early 2000s, we were farming 150 acres and feeding 50 steers, and we've been able to grow now to a little over 1,000 acres and feeding 400 animals. And I was fortunate enough to buy the second Swain farm beside us that had changed hands in the past, and it's made our home farm 220 acres. We have on the steel roof there is an old century barn, which is one feed yard, and then straight north of it on your left side is 2 outdoor feed yards that has a concrete bunk. And then off to my right is 2 concrete pads where we have seasonal pack storage for scrape alleys or packed manure will move. We have a unique sprayer business. 2 of my neighbors, one's the last pork producer in City of Kawartha Lakes, Meltheb Farms. They own 1/3 of that red sprayer. Swain Beef owns 1/3 of that red sprayer, and Spring Grove is a lamb operation. They have about 600 ewes to lamb to finish, and we share that unit. And then on the right is our New Holland. That's actually our second New Holland sprayer, and we have 4 partners. Ed Hansen is up here in one of the front tables, is a 1/4% owner in that, and then the original 3 members is in the red sprayer own the blue machine, and we're covering about 29,000 acres with those 2 machines. Our first rule of thumb was we don't do any custom spraying. If we plant it or harvest it, we'll spray it. And that's kind of our policy. So the reason I have these up here is I think these are a real major part of our nutrient management plan. Is they've allowed us to split apply all of our nitrogen on our corn, wheat, and oat crops, and they've definitely been critical for our no-till practices, just allowing us to maximize our time spraying. Back 8 years ago, we started side dressing and interseeding our corn pretty well at the same time. This was a unit that Ed Hansen put together and was going through the area and custom applying, and he mounted this APV up on the front of it, and it was allowing us to broadcast annual rye, radishes, oats, turnips, peas, etc., right into the existing stand of corn. And then we moved on. We bought this self-propelled New Holland sprayer and put a toolbar on it, so it was allowing us to apply a little faster, 16 rows at a time. And we were doing a couple of different applications. We could now blow on a little faster and cover more land. We had some really great results on wetter years. We had some real big plans that after the first couple of years, our cover crops interseeded in our corn was such a success that we thought we might even be able to grow more corn on corn and break that rotation in between. And then as we realized our no-till practices, had so much organic matter, and in drier years it really limited our seed to soil contact. So our results started getting much more marginal. We really had a lot of success though with annual ryegrass. It was our favorite. And as we went through the experiences of how we were going to deal with it in the spring, and we had some really good successes as well, no-tilling into this annual rye crop. But there was definitely some management practices that we had to adapt to, and it made it absolutely great for spreading manure in the spring. We did some strip tillage of rye of cover crops, and then one of our other nutrient methods that we've gone to split application is our Y dropping. And I think this Y dropping has become really important for allowing us to spread our nitrogen so much later in the season, because we have so much pack manure. I think we have a lot of variable releasing on our land of organic manure and synthetic manures through the season. And then we're able to utilize these Y drops as well to spray a fungicide and insecticide in crop. And for the 3 producers of us that grow crops specifically for livestock production, a fungicide and insecticide is pretty well has become just a mandatory decision for us, because we're really trying to drop our vomitoxins in our feed corn and our silage corn, specifically to improve production. And Todd Malcolm was probably the bigger pusher on that. That showed us that if pigs can't digest vomitoxins, then we're starting to realize the rest of our ruminant animals are also included in that. So going into the livestock, I think we produce really top quality Ontario corn-fed beef, and our goal is to structure our livestock feeds around our cover crops and try and find as many benefits as we can. So we always ask ourselves, how do we cut our costs, obviously in feed, our manure, and improve our animal welfare and health at the same time? So we started fencing our home farm about 5 years ago, and we turned our home farm into 3 different sections, fences including, we'd either run 2 or 3 wires depending on what the fence was separating, and then we're running a strictly corn, wheat, soybean rotation. So after our wheat comes off, we'll harvest it, and then we'll plant fall rye, oats, turnips, and radish. And once the cover crop's between 2 and 4 inches, we'll try to target to get our pack manure all spread on there. We're putting about 10 metric ton per acre on late September, and then right after that, we'll once we get some more growth, we've been adding some cows on these chunks of land. So for this example, we're putting about 50 cows on 70 acres. I would call it where we started progressively pasturing them, and that means we'd either run a single line to separate new feed and old feed, new feed. So those cows were just slowly progressing through it, and we're charging $1 per cow per day. And we don't have any cows. We're strictly feedlot. So we were trying to target to get 60 days out of them. Then we'd switch them over the field beside it, which was corn stalks, and depending on the weather, these are Kemp Bros cows. They're a concession south of us. They start calving in January, would restrict the time we could leave them out in the field. And then I was always pretty critical on compaction with those cows and what they would do with the field, and we really wanted to restrict feeding them out there. And in 2019, we've kind of changed our direction. This year we've had 100 stockers, 550-pound heifers we put out on our cover crops and corn stalks, and we're running our own trial. We have 3 different groups of the same quality cattle, trying to achieve the same targets. And right now, by the end of this month, those heifers have been on that, finishing on those corn stalks. They'll be out there for 150 days. Their average gain is 2 pounds a day. We haven't used any straw, and we've seen an improvement in the animal's health on those cattle compared to our feedlot pen cattle. So it's been a very interesting winter for us. So one of the biggest risks that we're always concerned about is yes, we are spreading manure in through the winter season, and my math, which is questionable and challengeable, says we're spreading about 400 kgs of manure per acre, and that's within that 150 days. In my mind, I'm very comfortable with that. We don't have any tiles on that farm. All of our spring runoff runs in one direction, and I don't see any sediments moving with that water, that surface runoff. And I really, in the next couple of weeks, we'll probably draw some water samples off that and just see if we can find any nitrates. One other thing we were doing is we always had these intercrops with our harvester. So my original intention when we were interseeding corn, we'd be able to spread manure on the silage ground after, or we would graze it. But we always found that once the corn was removed, the silage corn, those plants were really fragile and they'd basically dry up and shrink down, and there was really no continuous growth on it, so it was kind of limited. We bale a lot of corn stalks, about 400 or 500 bales per year. I know we do a fair bit of field compaction damage with that, but it's real critical for our winter bedding. We hire all of our manure spread. There's a contractor that has 3 of these units, and we spread 90% of our packed manure on cover crops after wheat, and then we're always trying to get right behind it and fall graze it, and then we'll go back into that land with corn and spring no-till. Depending, we try to desiccate that the last week or of November or early December if we can push it that late. Excuse me. We do have some seasonal some seasonal field storage on a couple different farms. We're always trying to keep our manure moving. We try to move the piles 2 or 3 times. When I say move them, we're just either rolling them over or moving location to get closer to the area we're going to get spread. Reason for it is it improves our fly control in the summer. I believe we're increasing our value and lowering our spreading expenses. Our average pack manure nutrients is 11N, 10P, and 16K, and we're rotating our manure application every 4 years. So each piece of dirt, we'll get it every 4. If our name's on the mortgage, we'll try and apply fertilizer every 4 years. So future, what's our plans is we really are going to try and target our whole 220 acres into fall grazing right through the winter, and that will be our pre-backgrounding to our feedlot, and we're hoping next winter to have over 200 calves out there through the winter season. And then I would like to include some multi-use bunks so that we can control feeding on concrete and have them graze, and then try and maximize a little more efficiency on our 4Rs. I'm pretty lucky. I have a lot of family mentors and a lot of mentors in our area that have done a lot of livestock grazing and have been able to pass on their information that we've been able to gain on. Anyways, thanks very much.
What would be the cost of that air inflation system for a tanker?
For my system, because it
The question was, what's the cost of the air inflation system was the question for Wilfred.
the inflation system we put on, because it's the biggest system he built, it was a little bit of a trial and error thing, but and he did give us some grace on some of the components, but we spent $40,000 per unit.
Yep.
Just wondered why, Scott, you planted your winter wheat and then you spread your manure later, like in September after it was up already.
Sorry, maybe so what we do is we harvest our wheat, then we plant a cover crop, and then spread our manure. So
Right.
why do we spread our manure once the cover crop is up?
Right, yeah, why not do it right after you harvest your wheat and then plant into the,
Well, one, because we have a custom operator spread it, so his timing is sometimes not the week we're really looking for. But the second answer is I realize that if we're putting that nutrients down on a green crop, the green crop will basically absorb that nutrients and bury it quickly, and the smell will be gone within, I think, almost hours. For some reason, it just doesn't seem to have as big a smell impact to our neighbors as if it was bare ground. Maybe that's only in my mind, but that's something I'm seeing happen. And then my theory is that green living plant is going to suck up some of that nitrogen that's going to volatile to the sun because we're not incorporated.
Yeah, we're doing the same thing, Scott, some of our land, it's the exact same thing. We find that the smell, sorry. We're doing the same thing with some of our land.
Cooler too, so you don't lose as much.
The smell, it's gone within hours, and it's chicken flavor, so it's pretty cool.
Wouldn't you get more growth on your cover crop if you're gonna, say, graze it later, if you actually put it on?
No, you're gonna lose too much.
So do we get more growth on our cover crop if we graze it later?
No, if you put your manure on at planting time, right after winter wheat, instead of, it seems like you're waiting like at least a month or a month and a half after that's already up to 4 inches or something.
Yeah, and I think it's just because of timing as well, right? So we harvest the wheat, we bale the straw, we move the straw, plant the cover crop, application shows up to spread the manure. I think we're no longer trying to force too much into a short period of time. Are we losing growth out of that? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's possible.
I can maybe chime in. Is this the manure that was temporary field store that you applied in at that time?
Yes.
So if it's a manure that's temporary field stored, I was just asking Scott, and it was, it's very low portion in ammonia. So in other words, it's basically going to be a fairly stable form of nitrogen. So you're not going to lose that much ammonia because there isn't that much there to start with. Like you flip the piles once or twice, and so for the guys who do the composted manure for the organic standards, they get a lower volume of N, but it's a more stable N. So there's probably not going to lose that much to volatilization anyways. So
You're saying she's already lost it?
yes, exactly.
Ian?
Scott, in doing it the way you're doing it, I couldn't see from the picture. Sorry, I'm blind back here. There's more sophisticated meters to make sure you got uniform spread of that back manure.
Yeah, so that's why we don't spread any of our manure is we hire them with the vertical beaters, and 90% of the time they do a fantastic job. Just when they overload the spreaders, you get the clumps and that kind of stuff. And but yeah, basically it's ground sawdust by the time we get to it. So the ground sucks it up.
Sir?
Wilfred, you put that system on so you know what manure was going on the field as you go. How do you justify that, or how do your customers justify that, but then they won't justify saving it by incorporating it?
Well, I guess the secret is I haven't charged for it yet. So it's still new. We wanted to get some data in-house to work with this winter, and then this spring most of the customers know we have the thing in the tractors, so they're looking at it, and we've had, not all farmers are equal. We've had several that are very interested and want to know what's going on, and we have some that, in fact, insist that we delete everything because they don't want any information of their farm anywhere else. So so there's quite the gamut. But at the end of the day, to take a proper manure sample, how much does that cost? If I could already provide that and recover that cost, I'm actually doing okay. I can save some man hours on my end by having accurate maps and having stuff spread on the screens already for the guys. So it's I look at it as a customer retention tool rather than something like a surcharge for.
Somebody will legislate you
Well, documentation is already legislated. I have several filing cabinets full of every drop of shit I've spread for the last 18 years and never had anybody come looking at it. But now it's electronic. So.
Scott and Wilfred, is the system complete? What's the next step that you'll be taking based on your current experience?
From my standpoint, I'd like to move my customers into more cover crops, more rotation, so that I can have a more opportunity to spread manure at the proper time, that they can get value out of it. You know, none of this is getting any cheaper, so we'd like to see people realize some value out of it. You know, equipment-wise, what we're doing next is going to run sand through the drag lines, but that's a difference.
So for us, if we could go to variable rate pack manure on rented land that's been starving for nutrients, I think we could probably get our money back in 2 or 3 years quicker than that. It's just usually the cost of moving there, but if we had variable rate capability of that product, I think it would allow us to really be able to leapfrog with variable rate nutrients and seed on our planter as well.
Yes, sir?
I have the opportunity to purchase manure. I'm not sure how to price it. Any help in that regard? It's solid manure.
Depends how well you get along with them. That's,
Is there a formula from OMAFRA?
Yes.
most customers are taking NPK from the local agronomy center and negotiating between themselves, and sometimes it's as simple as covering the application. Sometimes there's some money changes hands, and depending on how desperate the guy is with a full pit, sometimes the guy letting the manure go is the one that's paying. So we have it going all over the map as far as prices go.
And yes, there is, Christine Brown does a comparison with manure nutrient analysis compared to commercial fertilizer prices, and does a value of various types of manure. And also Christine tries to take a look at the 2, 3, and 4 year value of it. Like, in other words, that whole thing that the manure is not all instantly available as well. So that's available on the website. And as Wilfred said, a big part of it will boil down to who's doing the application or who's paying for the application as well.
Ian?
Sorry, dominating questions that others aren't going to ask. I will. Wilfred, what's your comments on the amount of agitation that's needed to get that nutrient distributed properly? And is the sand lagoons different than the non-sand lagoons?
Certainly the sand lagoons are hugely variable compared to, let me step back there. The sand farms typically are fairly consistent from one to the other. The biggest changes we've seen in the rations. Like we have one sand farm that likes to use a lot of haylage. We have other farms that use soybean silage, and we have some 90% corn silage diets. And the manure does seem to be different from farm to farm on that. And when you get away from sand, is a straw, soybean straw, is a wheat straw, is a sawdust, there's quite a bit of difference in what goes in the pit. As far as agitation goes, obviously that has to be done properly. Like this, we've, in the days of the small 3-point prop and the 6-inch pumps, moved up to 8-inch pumps, and now moved up to the 12-inch pumps and the crawlers. We can get the pits mixed fairly consistent, fairly readily, and we draw them down so quickly that they don't have time to settle back out.
Yeah, sir.
Peter, you're saying some people there this year to get the corn off and had to go up December. What's the actual rules? Like, would they have to get a permit for that, or do they just state their case after the fact?
No, and so farms are split into 2 classes. So those farms that are big enough to have a nutrient management plan, there are some rules for them, there are some requirements for them with respect to winter spreading. So from December 1st to March 31st, they're not going to apply in the gullies or the depressions. If it's liquid, they're going to inject or incorporate. There are some limitations on slope within 150 meters of the water course, and you want to stay back about 100 meters also from the neighbor's well. For everybody else, you have to watch what's called adverse effect. And so even if you're not under nutrient management, if it starts to run across the property line onto the neighbors, you can still be held accountable. And so And part of it was, this year was two things, was the wet fall, both related to the wet fall. One was crop harvest was delayed, but the other one is that in East Central Ontario, there are relatively few custom applicators, and so they can only be in so many places. Like, it takes some time to get to every place as well. So, yeah. Yep.
Wilfred, from a custom application standpoint, I understand you don't charge yet for your analysis metering equipment, but as far as your CTIS systems, you say they're about 40,000 a unit. How do you quantify the amount that you're going to have to charge and change your rates to equip your equipment with that kind of a system? And I guess on the flip side of that, what kind of response do you get from your customers when you propose this to them?
I've been fortunate over the years that we've had some trust built up with my customers. We do have quite a few, so there's quite a range of customers. My key customers, which are the ones that have been with me the longest, and they're some of the larger farms that we deal with, obviously my larger portion of my income, we do talk to them and see what they want to see coming down. Tires was never on the radar up until a couple of years ago. Now the discussion's there, and now people can see some value in it. Will they put these systems on their own equipment? Not likely, because it's too expensive. For myself, we basically made the investment, and we charge accordingly, and I don't worry about my competitors. We will, maybe we'll lose some, but we'll gain some others that want this stuff to be used on their farms. So just on a scale basis, though, the $40,000 sounds like a lot of money, and it is for an individual farm. But just the other day, I figured out how to get a summary off my John Deere system there, and we put that on mid-season in October, and we covered 13,400 acres last fall with it. So now, obviously, the tire system, since 5 weeks it was on frozen ground, the tire system doesn't do a whole lot of good for that. But just to give a scale, when we spread it out per acre, it's really not that expensive for us to run it.
Okay, you probably have time for one more question, so. Yep.
Have you had the tire system long enough to notice if you're getting any savings in tire wear?
Not tire wear, but one of the very distinct things we had on the screen one day was tire slip. We were climbing a harvested soybean field. We were breaking traction 16 to 18% slip as soon as he deflated the tires 3%. So, if you follow all the anecdotal data from everybody else, it works.